All right, I like this quote. Through wisdom is a house builded, and by understanding it is established, and by knowledge shall the chambers be filled with all precious and pleasant riches. Also from Proverbs, remove not the ancient landmark which thy fathers have set. Why? Because it should be apparent at this point is that the ancient landmarks are the repositories of knowledge and wisdom. Victor Hugo in Notre Dame de Paris, he said, from the most immemorial temple of Hindustan to the Cathedral of Cologne, architecture has been the great manuscript of the human race. This is true to such a degree that not only every religious symbol, but every human thought has its page and memorial in that vast book. Now, my immersion into the study of architecture was a big part of what led me into this originally, because I was very much interested in building and architecture and so on. Trips to Europe and Central America and Egypt and stuff helped to fuel that interest. But, it quickly expanded to other areas as well. Once I began to realize that there was this kind of unanimity of underlying meaning to all of these different domains of human endeavor. So we're going to talk for a minute about the ancient guilds of initiated master builders and craftsmen. John Michell, one of my favorite authors, the late John Michell. So a tradition which has been credited by many learned men over the centuries is that the ancients encoded their knowledge of the world in the dimensions of their sacred monuments. And I think that bears out once we begin the study of it. So here are the parameters of sacred architecture as I have defined them. First of all, the symbol. And this is the encoding of the mythical and archetypal meaning, which is sort of at the beginning of thinking, the beginning of the conceptualization stage. You begin with that fundamental meaning represented by a symbol or a series of symbols. That's followed by number and measure, which is the modulus of the plan. And every ancient building had a modulus, some standard of measure that governed the layout and dimensions of the building. Then, of course, there was orientation, which means orienting to the cosmos. So it usually began with the sun and the motions of the sun, which will vary by latitude. You know that, and I'm going to speak from our perspective in the Northern Hemisphere, during winter solstice, the sun, if you look at its rising and setting points against the horizon, it's going to be as far south as it's going to get through the course of the year. And then 6 months later, it'll be far to the north. Depending on the latitude, there can be almost up to 90 degrees from a point of observation to those 2 points on the horizon, both the rising, which actually would be this way, and the setting, which would be this way, right? So the secondary phenomena would be the lunar motion. Now, the lunar motion is a bit more complicated. The lunar motion, the lunar orbit's tilted a little more than 5 degrees to the plane of the ecliptic. And so that's why, because of that tilt, the moon has to be on the plane of the ecliptic in order to have a solar eclipse, right? Notice the eclipse, ecliptic, right? So there's only certain times when the moon is crossing the ecliptic at the exact same time that the sun is there. And that, of course, is when we experience a solar eclipse or a lunar eclipse, which is the opposite of that. But within that motion, there is an 18.6-year cycle where the moon will have a minimum rising position and a minimum setting position, a maximum rising and a maximum setting position. And it goes through a full cycle, kind of like this. And it does that every 18.6 years. So how remarkable is it that people all over the ancient world enshrined that 18.6-year cycle of the moon in their architecture? Now, obviously, an agricultural society isn't going to need that kind of degree of accuracy of lunar observations. In fact, you're not going to have to build huge henges with 20-ton stones to track the solstitial and equinoctial movement of the sun. All you need is a stick in the ground. Some backside on the horizon and a circle around the stick. I take students out and show them how that's done. It's quite simple, actually. So why would they erect these giant monuments of stone? Like when we look at Stonehenge, we see that you have two very distinct types of stone. You have the blue stones are a rhyolite, which is an igneous rock. The sarsen stones are a sandstone, which is a sedimentary rock with lots of quartz. And I think that composition of those stones was very carefully determined, and it wasn't just random. Okay, so we have cosmic orientation, the astronomical alignments. Then we have the siting, which I call sacred geography. And this is the association with geological and geomantic structures and patterns. So not only were these complexes of sacred buildings and temples and outliers and roadways and causeways and all of the things that created these intricate patterns in the landscape, they were doing two things. They were reflecting the heavens, like Ed was saying, some of the motion of certain key objects in the heavens, such as Sirius, was very important. The Pleiades was very important. Arcturus was also important. A number of stars that were whose motions were actually worked in, almost as if you imagine the motion of the heavens, and by projecting those motions onto the surface of the earth, creating patterns. And those patterns then are not arbitrary, so you lay out your complexes according to those patterns. And this is what I'm calling sacred geography. And also, I say with geological and geomantic structures, the work of Paul Devereux, who I interviewed with years ago, has done a lot of work on that, but others have followed up on it, which is that many of the ancient structures are associated with the ancient sacred sites and temples are associated with the underlying patterns within the lithosphere, including fault lines, the movement of underground water, crystal deposits, and so on. And it strikes me that not only were the ancient builders astronomers, they were also geologists. And they, interestingly, like the 7 or 8 cathedrals that are dedicated to the Notre Dame in France, recreate a very, very close approximation of the constellation of Virgo in the sky. Now, that's interesting because, of course, they're all dedicated to Mary, the Virgin, the Notre Dame, right? But the other thing that struck me as interesting is, to my knowledge that I've been able to research, they are all centered over the confluence of underground streams of water. There is several streams of underground water converging under the high altar in Chartres Cathedral. I don't think I have it to show you here, but I might. You go down in the crypt below, and there's a well, and you can actually see the water table down there in the well as the water flows under. Now, there is some very interesting research suggesting that the motion of water, particularly through under pressure under the ground, can actually affect the geomagnetic field in certain ways. Now, this can actually be amplified because the moon creates tides in the ocean, right? And they're visible. But it also creates tides throughout the entire hydrosphere. So the subterranean waters are also subjected to those tidal forces, which means at certain times of the month, you might have water moving under greater pressure than at other times. I think all that was taken into account. And then we have sacred geometry, which is the harmonic design, form, pattern, dynamic symmetry. So in other words, you've got the symbol, then you've got to come up with the modulus of the plan, which gives you your core numbers. You've got to orient it to the cosmos. It has to be sited with respect, as I say here, geological, geomantic structures and patterns. Geomancy is the study of the patterns of energy as it's related to the earth. How many of you ever seen or tried dowsing? Quite a few of you. I think dowsing, I've seen it and I've tried it. I believe it's real. I've known people that work for mining companies. I've known Marines that were in Vietnam. I've known people that work for excavating companies whose services as dowsers are actually being utilized on a professional level, by companies that obviously had a pretty vested interest in the results of those dowsing surveys being accurate, right? And then the final thing, alchemy, which is the preparing of the raw materials. And there were certain procedures, certain methodologies by which the raw materials were prepared. We find that really reflected in the building of the Gothic cathedrals. And I just mentioned the utilization of different types of stone in Stonehenge. We find what appears to be a very intentional effort to use contrasting types of stone and material in a lot of the North American monumental earthworks. There are, you think of an earth mound as being pretty much just a heap of earth, a random heap of earth, but that's not what it is. It's a very carefully layered and vetted multiple layers structure, and oftentimes, or in fact, probably most of the time that I've been able to see, those layers are not of the same material. They're contrasting material. In some cases, it might be heavier on the mineralogical side. On others, the layer may have more organic material in it. And that kind of brings us back to some of the work of, some of the suppressed scientific work of a number of individuals. I'll say Wilhelm Reich is one who comes to mind, who discovered in his control and utilization of what he called the life energy or orgone, depended upon creating like instruments or boxes, whatever, using alternate types of layered material that look very close to mimicking what the ancient builders of the mounds in North America. And very interesting things. And there have been a lot of studies that are kind of out there, more or less consigned to the fringe, but showing that there are unusual energies and things associated with a lot of the ancient structures. Personally, I think that those energies are just residual energies and probably only a fraction of what was actually there when these structures were operational. So in our history, we've seen that there have been a number of episodes, like I call this the Great Work, the 3rd millennium BC. Within a couple of centuries, you had all of this stuff going on. The construction of the massive megalithic structures and earthworks in the British Isles in Northwest Europe, the building of pyramids at Giza and other large-scale Egyptian works, the construction of the great urban complexes of the Indus Valley, the building of the ziggurats and other great temple complexes of the Mesopotamian Valley, and the first wave of monumental earthworks in North America. All of this stuff was going on within a period of a couple of centuries. And it all began almost as if somebody blew a whistle, and at these multiple places around the planet, somebody picked up their trowels and went to work. If we come forward in time to 1200 AD, we have the flowering of the great Gothic building enterprise in Europe. We've got the construction of pyramids and vast temple complexes in Central and South America, the building of vast temple complexes in Southeast Asia, in Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and so on, and the final construction phase of massive stone and earthwork complexes in North America, such as the Hopewell and the Anasazi. Again, within a very short period of time historically, it's like after a period of inactivity, all of a sudden something galvanized these people in these far distant locations around the planet to suddenly decide that they're going to build these enormous structures and these complexes and so on. The interesting thing about this is, as I said, when you begin to look at all of these structures, every one of them conforms to this list right here. Now, here's the question. Were these people independently coming up with this system, independently, in Southeast Asia and in North America, were they independently going, okay, we're going to lay out these structures to show the motions of the moon, or to embody this certain very specific sacred geometry? Or, are we going to try to orient these structures to whatever is happening geologically in the site? Is there some inspirational force that sees these people all at the same time? Or was there a tradition, a legacy of this, let's use the word technology, this technology here, and at some point, someone organized, because look, when we look at any of these things, it would require a massive amount of organization. If you think about the Gothic cathedral era in Europe, which only lasted between, really at its peak, 120 to 150 years, right? It began, construction on the first Notre Dame Cathedral began in 1130. By the end of the 1200s, the effort had almost expended itself, which is interesting because it coincides pretty much precisely with the major deterioration of climate. When we went from the medieval warm period, which was warmer than now, by the way, into the Little Ice Age, there was a series of crop failures, which led to famine, which led to pestilence, and then you had I think in about the 1340s, you had the bubonic plague, and that pretty much spelled the death knell for this tremendous enterprise. But if you look at what was built in that little period, you had over 80 of these great monuments on the scale of Notre Dame, Reims, Amiens, Chartres, Leon, these amazing buildings, these amazing structures. And then you had about 500 lesser abbeys that were being built at the same time. And then they all kind of started within a decade or two of each other and all seemed to taper off and end within a decade or two of each other. Now, at the same time this is happening in Europe, we have the final wave of great building in the southwestern deserts of the US, out there in the Chacoan culture. We have the final wave of the great monumental earthwork structure in the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, right? Is this a coincidence that for whatever reason, people in North America, Central America, Europe, Indonesia were suddenly seized with this inspiration to go to work and build these incredible structures, all using a very similar system. And now, even though if you look at, a monumental earthwork of North America, it's very obviously distinct from a Gothic cathedral. Nobody's going to mistake one for the other yet. The geometry and the proportions and the numbers that show up over and over again, they're the same. They're the same.